Hi everyone. As everyone's just logging in, we'll just give this another minute, and then we'll get started. So, um, we'll just, if you don't mind waiting a sec. All right. Um, so thank you guys for joining us. We have a few more people signing in now. And oh yeah, nice to see you, Helen. Thanks. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Jessica and this is Kelly, and we'll get started. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming. For those who don't know our company, we are Detail Roofing and Sheet Metal, a service-based roofing company specializing in leak investigations, preventative maintenance, and localized repairs on all roof types. We service multi-unit residential, commercial, as well as industrial properties within a large region of Southern Ontario, along with operations in Lower Mainland of BC as Design Roofing, where we've been for about 40 years now. We're well known for our comprehensive photo reports, which document step-by-step processes of everything we do up on your roof and descriptions to assure that things are easily translated to your boards. So again, Jessica Campbell. I am an account manager here at Detail Roofing, and Kelly, she is client engagement and events. She'll be leading today's presentation. Before we start, we're just going to go over a few housekeeping items. So for any managers joining, this webinar is valid for 1 CPE credit, and you'll be able to report those in the CMRAO portal today. The Zoom attendance report will be provided to the CMRAO as your proof of attendance and completion of this learning activity. Certificates will not be issued, so don't wait for that. You can just log in and report. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube before the end of the week. Viewing the recording does not count for CPE credit. And please utilize the Q&A feature to submit your questions during the presentation. Then at the end, we're going to have a session just to go over as many questions as we can within the allotted time. If you have questions that aren't answered, we can go over those afterwards. Am I missing anything, Kelly?
That's it.
Okay, I will hand this over to you.
Thank you very much. I also just wanted to note that there was an option for people to submit any questions upon registration. So we did get a couple of those. So for anybody that did pre-submit any questions, we do have that built into the presentation so that we will be addressing that throughout the course of the presentation for you. So just to get started here, just some background information. Over the last 5 years or so, every year around this time, somewhere between January to March, we typically always do a webinar like this that covers at least ice damming and winter issues in some capacity. Now, heading into this year, because of the last few winters and the lack of ice damming that we were seeing and the lower snow volumes, we didn't originally plan to do a presentation that covered this topic this year. But then, of course, last month in the middle of February, we got hit with back-to-back snowstorms in the GTA, where throughout the month we had a total snowfall of 78 centimeters. However, it was mostly between the 12th to the 16th of February where we had those multi-day snowstorms, where we really saw it was about 50 to 55 centimeters of snow, resulting in the deepest snowpack that we've seen since 1999. So of course, following that, we saw widespread leak issues. And in a lot of cases, it wasn't just one or two units leaking at a particular complex or a building. It was dozens of units that were leaking. And then, of course, we also saw really severe ice damming, some of the most severe ice damming cases that we've ever seen here. So, of course, what we want to be talking about today is what we saw during this time and what we can learn from it and do in the future. So first, we're going to be taking a look at leak remediation during these periods of extreme winter weather. From there, we're going to be talking all about ice damming. So we're going to talk about what ice damming is, how it happens, and what the solutions are, or what the preventative methods are if you are experiencing ice damming. And then finally, we have a few cases, and these are specifically cases where the roof was either brand new or relatively new, and they were experiencing interior leak issues. So we have three cases there that we're going to be taking a look at more extensively. And then, as Jessica mentioned, at the very end, we will have time allotted for a Q&A. So please feel free to submit any questions using the Q&A function. Get into it now. Oh, and sorry, we are going to be having some polls throughout. So Jessica, if you want to launch our first poll right now.
Okay, so it should be live on your end. The first question is, did your corporation experience ice damming this winter? Let's see. I'll leave a moment if you all want to respond, and then I'm gonna end the poll. Okay. Hopefully everyone got the chance to respond. Let's share the results. So we have 45% of attendees saying yes, 52 saying no, and 3% are not sure.
Well, that's great that even though so many people, more than half of attendees here didn't, but are still joining us today just to learn more about ice damming. So that's great.
Yeah, you can always learn more. It was very, very, just an exceptionally bad winter for ice damming.
So yeah, as Jessica literally just said, it was a very bad winter that we experienced this year. Not only did we have this extreme snowfall in February, but also even in January and other parts of the winter, we had really extreme cold throughout this whole winter, whereas the last few years have been milder on average. I remember February of last year, more than half of the month, it was double digits. It felt like summer in February. So in a standard winter where we are experiencing milder temperatures and not as significant amounts of snowfall, moving some snow around for the purpose of investigating the roof surface or completing any localized repairs usually isn't too difficult. Where we really run into issues, and what was a big issue this year in particular, was the ice that we experienced. So whether it was on a flat or a sloped roof, if it was just surface level ice or the ice damming that we experienced, a lot of these situations that we came across, it was really heavy, really thick ice that was built up on these roof surfaces, which made investigation and remediation a lot more difficult. So in these cases, there were some cases where it's not impossible to see what's going on or provide different solutions, but just something to be mindful of, that especially when we're dealing with really extreme winter weather, like really heavy snow accumulation and this buildup of ice, it does make things more difficult, partially because of the safety aspect. We had a lot of situations where safe roof access wasn't possible for our roofing technicians, especially in the days as the snow was falling and immediately after. And then also with the level of ice that we saw, it's also hard to prevent any building damages by trying to remove ice in certain situations. We did come across some situations where the level of ice wasn't as severe, so it was just moving snow. But again, just something to keep in mind that it did become a lot more difficult both to investigate and remediate. So in this time, and again, especially in the days as the snow was falling and immediately after, a lot of our focus was more on what we can do for interior remediation and just limiting the amount of interior damages. So we have two cases here that we're going to look at. This one in particular, when we were called out, I can't remember the exact day, but it was in those periods where there was active snowfall. This was something that we had attended in the evening. It was an emergency leak. So in this case, before we had arrived, the resident here had cut open the ceiling where the active leak was happening. Whether or not we would recommend the resident cutting the ceiling, maybe not so much, but having the ceiling cut open either by a roofing professional or by a remediation company can help if there is any active water ingress, just so it's not sitting and building up behind the ceiling area. So in this case, they were able to put a bucket down on the floor to catch that water. When we were on site for the investigation, seeing behind the ceiling there, all the ducting that was in place, there weren't any signs of any water ingress from that or from it being a condensation issue. And behind that area, we did see some active water coming from one of the beams above, indicating that it was coming from the roof level. When we were accessing the roof, not only on the area directly above and the accessible roof surface, was there a lot of snow built up. We had tried to remove some of it, but there was snow, there was ice. And then also in this situation, there were deck boards that were covering the membrane that were severely frozen at the time as well. So doing a thorough investigation here, especially in the time allotted after hours, was difficult. It was something where we had to return a couple days later. So in the meantime, we just had something installed there to help direct the water, just to prevent any further interior damages until a return visit could be scheduled. So fortunately, we did get at least a little bit of relief, not too long after the snow fell, where there were some warmer days and some melt had occurred. So we were able to revisit this site in particular to do a more thorough investigation, where it was found that the scupper drain had quite a few deficiencies. It just wasn't roofed in properly with membrane. So there were a few openings on many of the sides. In this photo, it's hard to see, but there's also the membrane stops a little short here, allowing another water entry point. So especially with the amount of snow and ice that were built up in this area, it makes sense that with these deficiencies that it was leaking into the area directly below. So upon that return visit, we were able to access the area, dry it, apply temporary repairs, and provide the further recommendations. So this is another one that we had visited. In this case, also because of the amount of snow and ice on the roof surface, safe roof access wasn't possible during this visit. And then at the time, we weren't permitted attic access to see what was happening there. But it was noted that there was a leak happening above this window area here. So again, at least as a temporary solution to prevent any further water infiltration into these areas, we did install poly, a form of plastic barrier, on top of these areas just to help mitigate any further water infiltration in these areas. Another thing that we had done during this time, which unfortunately I didn't have any photos available that would be good for the purpose of a presentation like this. But one of the solutions that we did come across was if we were able to find a water entry point in an attic space, if there was an attic present, installing a diverter from the water entry point into the soffit vent so that at least the water was draining out of the soffit instead of leaking into the area directly below, and again, causing any further interior damages. So this actually leads us to our first pre-submitted question that we received. And Jess, I'm going to pose this to you. What's the best way to deal with thaw leaks that don't reoccur during a water test or normal rain occurrences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So leaks, they're not a perfect science, and water testing is sometimes possible. However, like each situation is going to be unique, so it's important to understand what like all the factors involved are. I think a lot of times people think leak investigation or sorry, water testing, that's great. We can go up on roof level and reactivate the leak. Sometimes that's not possible within either the allotted time because the water might be traveling or slowly dripping into the livable space, or perhaps like the leak point is somewhere else. It's slightly out of the water testing zone. So that's one possibility. And then the other is just that it could be a concurrent issue. Perhaps something not related to the roof is going on.
All right. So we get asked this all the time, especially this time of year when it is very topical, but what is ice damming? So ice damming is an ice barrier that forms along the roof edge when snow melts and then refreezes. So ice damming can be an issue for multiple reasons. Part of the reasons why it can be an issue is because when that ice dam forms, water can become trapped underneath the ice, which can prevent adequate drainage from the roof surfaces. And then ice damming also has potential to cause interior leaks and exterior building damages. I remember a few years ago, there was a story, I don't know that if it was specifically related to ice damming or just ice formation that had happened, but there was a building downtown Toronto where a piece of ice had fallen and gone through a Canada Post truck. So it was one of those situations that is a bit of a rare scenario. Unfortunately, nobody was injured, but it's definitely a scary thing to think of the damage that these large ice formations can cause. And again, I think because of the severity of the ice damming that we saw this year, we did see some cases in complexes that we were going to where there were really severe damages being caused by the level of ice damming. So this one in particular was by far the worst case that we saw as far as damages and just the amount of ice damming that was happening. So as you can see from some of these photos, these are chunks of ice that were forming along the roof edge at the gutters and coming down. And then this wasn't happening at all units, but there were many units where the ice had fallen and damaged these front entryways, mostly the wooden structures, but then there was some other railings that were damage from this ice buildup as well. So it can cause really severe damages. And again, fortunately, in this case, also nobody was injured, but ice damming is a problem for a lot of issues. Now, just before we dive into how ice damming occurs and what prevention steps can be taken, we're just going to launch our second poll here.
All right. So our second poll question, I'm hopeful you can all see this. Does ice damming directly cause leaks? So yes, no, or sometimes. And I'll just leave a moment for you to reply. I'm stalling. And I'm gonna end the poll. Looks like everyone's okay. I'll end it now. All right. So for the respondents, we've got 38% saying yes, ice damming directly causes leaks. We have 19% saying no, and 44 sometimes. I didn't click share results. Now you can look at it. Sorry. Technology. Okay, I will stop sharing.
So technically any answer is right because the answer is sometimes they can be directly related. So yes and no. Um, Ice damming can directly cause leaks, especially if there are any weak points or deficiencies along the edge of the roof surface where that ice formation is happening. So what we tend to see most often as far as leaks directly from ice damming are when it's built up along the roof edge here, even if the shingles are in good condition and they're not deteriorated, if there's not any metal drip edge or any sort of waterproofing underlayment or ice and water shield underneath the shingles at the roof edge, then when this ice formation is happening, it can back up under the shingles and cause an interior leak. So for this reason, and it is part of the Ontario Building Code that a minimum of 3 feet of waterproofing underlayment, ice and water shield is required of the first 3 feet of the roof edge. But we've come across a lot of cases, especially when a roof is being replaced, that this step is being missed and the shingles are just being installed directly over top of the plywood. So in these cases, again, that's where we can tend to see leaks that are directly from ice damming. Now, something to keep in mind is that you can also have ice damming occurring and have leaks coming from other roof deficiencies that are not right where the ice is happening. It could be further up towards the peak of the roof from a number of different areas. But you could also have ice damming occurring and have no leaks or have no reported leaks. Either way, whether there are leaks occurring or not, it's very important to determine where the water entry point is and also to determine what the root cause of the ice damming occurrence is so that that can also be corrected. So with that in mind, how does ice damming occur and why did we see so much of it this year versus previous years where there was very minimal amounts of ice damming? So first of all, we do need snowfall and accumulation. From there, the snow will melt, trickling down the slope of the roof surface. And then finally, if there are sub-zero temperatures following the snow melt, then that will cause the melted snow to refreeze. So thinking of last year, for example, As mentioned, we did get some snowfall, not the level of snow that we received this year, but it was overall very mild. And, I'm thinking of 2 years ago in March, I believe it was March 3rd, 2023, we got a pretty substantial snowfall overnight. It was somewhere between 20 to 25 centimeters. But the following day was very mild. It felt like a spring day. It wasn't frigid like we experienced recently where we had all this snowfall and then it was freezing in the days following. So 2 years ago in March 2023, even though we had this snow accumulation, because we didn't have the freezing temperatures afterwards, we didn't really see ice damming issues occurring at this time. So one thing that we really want to focus on here when it comes to how ice damming occurs is that second step where the snow melts. So the melted snow on the roof surface can be attributed to interior heat loss from within the home and typically related to deficiencies within the attic. Sorry. So yeah, related to deficiencies within the attic. So that is why we would recommend, if there is an attic space at the property, we would recommend having the attic inspected to determine exactly what's going on there and what the source of heat loss is to determine any corrective issues. So especially because of the climate that we live in, the attic serves a very important, very functional purpose in a home. So it helps to regulate temperatures within the home. So the conditioned space stays conditioned by the attic. And then also, again, especially in a colder climate like we have, the attic will help to vent any interior moisture out of the roof surface. And then finally, the components of the attic will also help to maintain a cooler roof temperature so that, as we were just looking at, it would prevent cases where the roof is becoming too warm and causing any accumulated snow to melt. So just something to keep in mind is that any time of the year, the temperature in the attic should be very comparable to the outside temperature. It might be off by a few degrees, but it shouldn't be more than a few degrees. And just looking at the different aspects of an attic and how they function together to promote a well-functioning problem-free space. So a well-functioning attic to help keep any interior heat inside the conditioned living space, you're going to have attic insulation with a vapor barrier underneath evenly distributed throughout the space. One thing you want to be mindful of is that the insulation is not blocking the very edge of the roof because that's where you're going to have your typically soffit vents for air intake. It's very important for there to be adequate airflow throughout the attic. So that's achieved by the cool air coming in at the lower edge of the roof through the air intake soffit vents. And then it's going to move through the attic and then out at the peak of the roof, either right towards the ridge or at the ridge. We're seeing a lot more ridge vents installed these days. But either way, those are your air outtake vents. They should be clear and unobstructed. Their purpose is just to allow that cool air to move through and then out through the outtake vents at the top. Another very important aspect is for any interior exhaust connections. So this would be for bathroom fans or kitchen fans. They should be properly connected to the fan box, installed vertically up to the compatible roof vent, and then venting out of the roof surface. So where we tend to see issues is if any of these systems are disrupted or not functioning properly. So that could be if there's not a sufficient level of insulation, if the insulation is blocking the air intake ventilation, if the exhaust vents, if they are not connected properly. When you think about it, those spaces that are being vented, the bathrooms and the kitchens, when those fans are being turned on, it's typically because somebody's having a hot shower or they're cooking something over the stove that's generating a lot of steam. You want to make sure that any of those things are being vented directly out of the roof surface. Otherwise, that's just hot, moist air that's pumping directly into the attic. As far as things to check for, if you are having a professional come in to complete an overall attic inspection, first and foremost, identifying if there are any signs of moisture or staining throughout the attic, and especially along the roof deck, making sure that the air intake vents are in place and clear. If there are cases where the insulation is blocking the soffit vents at all, then baffles are possible. So baffles are just going to create an airflow channel at the soffit vents to allow the cool air to come inside. Uh, what we're seeing, especially more recently, is some homes are being built with wooden baffles already built into the attic structure. And then where they're not already existing, you can get styrofoam baffles that are installed to again create those airflow channels. As far as the air outtake vents, so we can see some examples of those here. These vents that we can see here is called an AF50 vent, and we have an example in a few slides of what that looks like. But as I mentioned, ridge venting is also a possible air outtake ventilation system. We see whirlybird vents or box vents. But either way, there should be about 1 square foot of outtake ventilation for every 300 square feet of attic space. These should be unobstructed and nothing should be connected to them. When I say unobstructed, so that would include any of the roof joists should not be installed directly over where this opening is for the outtake vents, because ultimately that is going to impact how much air can move through that space. Again, the exhaust ducting, making sure that it's installed vertically and properly connected at both ends. The insulation and vapor barrier are in place and sufficient for the space. The fan boxes at the exhaust vents have a vapor barrier and are adequately sealed. And then if the existing ducting is piping, that it's properly insulated where that may be required. Now, one of the things that we want to highlight here in particular is the exhaust ventilation, because it is by far the most common issue that we come across when we're accessing attics. It's either that it has become disconnected or loose, and therefore either at the fan box or somewhere else, you just have that air that's pumping again directly into the attic. But we also see a number of cases where it was never installed to adequately vent out of the attic. So in this case here, I apologize, it's a little bit hard to see, but this ducting is very close to the roof surface. You can see there's a blackness right there from where there's an opening because that's not adequately connected. So even though it's very close to the roof surface, it doesn't have that proper connection and there is air leakage that's occurring. In this case here, again, it's a case where they had it very close to the roof surface. In this case, there was ridge venting installed as the air outtake. So rather than having this ducting connected to a proper compatible rooftop vent, they just had it taped to this joist, which was then venting out of the ridge venting. So again, if it's not connected properly, if it's not airtight, if it's become disconnected at either side, then that's just hot, moist air that's pumping into the attic and can lead to really severe cases of condensation. So before I was mentioning one of the most common types of air outtake vents that we see is an AF50 vent. So that is an example here of what an AF50 vent looks like. This one here is an exhaust vent or a stem vent. Now on the underside of these vents, this one has the proper connection to be connected to exhaust ducting, whereas this, because it's strictly for air outtake, as we saw from some of those earlier slides, it's just open on the inside. It doesn't have the proper piece to connect to the ducting. So having any interior exhaust ducting connected to an AF50 or any other sort of air outtake vent, it's not going to be compatible and you are going to experience air leakage. So that's what we have in this case here. A lot of the times when we're seeing this, it's very common to see it kind of taped to something on the side or to the roof surface. But again, either way, being close enough to the roof is not good enough. It needs to be connected to a compatible vent. And then Jessica, we're going to launch our third poll here.
So the third poll, how can you tell if a thorough attic inspection is required? And our options are an interior leak is occurring, ice damming is occurring, snow coverage on the roof is uneven, known or suspected pest infiltration, and then all of the above. I see a couple more people responding, and I'm about to end the poll. Okay, ending, and I am sharing the results. Okay, so our respondees, we have 91% of people saying all of the above, and then we have 6% with an interior leak is occurring, and 3% with ice damming is occurring.
Great, yes. So all of the above. If any of these things are occurring, it is a solid indication that you should have your attic inspected. So in any case where there's an interior leak, regardless of the time of year, if there is an attic space in the home, we would always recommend accessing and inspecting the attic as well as the roof surface, just because there could be an issue in the attic that is contributing to the leak or causing a separate issue. So making sure that that is included just to get an idea of what's happening in the attic, regardless of what time of year. And then, of course, if there is ice damming occurring, accessing the attic to determine what's going on in there and what may be contributing. Also, and again, this is something that's more common outside of the winter months, but if there has been any known or suspected pest infiltration issues, in those cases, we would also recommend having the attic thoroughly inspected after any pests have been removed from the space, just to make sure that, especially if they were living in there for a while, that they didn't disrupt anything within the attic, or that they didn't damage or contaminate any of the insulation. And then finally, something that you can look out for, whether or not there's any ice damming or ice formation along the eaves, is when there's snow accumulation, keep an eye out for the overall snow coverage on roof surfaces. If you notice that the majority of the complex or surrounding homes have snow all throughout the roof surfaces, but then there's some roof surfaces where the snow has melted or the level of melt is just uneven and inconsistent. That could be a sign that there are attic issues that are occurring that are, again, not helping to stabilize the overall temperature of the roof, and meaning that it's too warm in that space, which is leading to the melt on that roof surface versus a more consistent coverage on other roof surfaces. Typically, if it's simply the temperature outside or the sun that is melting snow in these cases, you would see it a bit more evenly across all of these roof surfaces versus these ones which are extremely covered in a lot of cases, and then the back ones that have the uneven coverage. Now, ice damming is not something that only happens on sloped roof surfaces with attic spaces. It can happen on sloped roof spaces that have a vaulted ceiling that don't have a traditional attic space, and it can also happen on flat roofs. So ultimately, if ice damming is occurring, it still would be a heat loss issue. And again, this isn't something where there is a one size fits all solution. It would be dependent on the issues that are specific to the building. But again, looking at uh, different things like if there is an ice and water shield installed beneath the membrane, if there is insulation beneath the membrane, if that's sufficient, and then any insulation behind the ceilings or walls, just to make sure that, again, any of these conditioned areas are staying conditioned and heat isn't rising to the point that it is impacting the overall temperature of the roof surface. In a lot of these cases, whether it's flat roofing or sloped roofs with vaulted ceilings, we have seen a lot of cases where heating cables are being utilized. Heating cables can be a useful tool just to help limit the amount of ice damming that's occurring. However, this year in particular, with the level of snowfall that we received and the level of ice damming, it really showed the limitations to heating cables. We went to a number of sites that did have heating cables installed. In some cases, they were installed even in cases where there was a traditional attic space. But even still, it wasn't the same level of ice damming that we saw at some of these other complexes. That was a little more extreme looking, but it didn't stop the ice damming from occurring, and it didn't stop the snow from accumulating in these areas. So if there's not any snowfall, if we have a very mild winter, or if it's not a winter season, does that mean that there's no problem and no need to access or investigate the attic? Not necessarily. Because as mentioned, these attic deficiencies, they can still lead to really excessive condensation in some cases, even if there's not any ice damming or any known interior leaks happening. So not only can this prolonged condensation lead to really excessive mold growth, which can be a potential health hazard for residents, but it can also lead to, especially if it's happening over time, it can cause the wood deck to rot, which is then going to compromise the structure of the roof. So now we want to get to one of the pre-submitted questions that we got. And this is a question that I can see somebody already posed something related to this in the chat, and it's a question that comes up very often. So that is, what is the current building specification on attic insulation? And if the units were built more than 50 years ago and have recently suffered water damage, would the corporation be responsible to increase the insulation to current building specifications? So the Ontario Building Code recommends that attics have a minimum, or the insulation in the attics has a minimum R value of R60. And in just a second, we'll go over what that means and how to achieve an R value of R60. Um, but this is for any newly built homes. So anything that is 50 years old, 30, 20, anything like that, it's very likely that that wouldn't have an insulation with an R value of R60 unless over time insulation was replaced or added to achieve that value. Now, typically, especially because of how often the building code can change and how much it has changed in the last few decades, uh, if if your attic isn't currently achieving that R60, it's not mandatory to update it. However, in this case, if you're mentioning that it has encountered water damage, that is absolutely something that you would want to have replaced. And then also, even if it's not required, it's still going to impact the overall thermal efficiency of the home, and upgrading it would help to prevent any attic issues. So even though it may not be required, it would be recommended if you do have an older home or if there is water damage that's been experienced. So just diving in a little bit more in regards to attic insulation, as mentioned, it is recommended that the R value is a minimum of R60. And what the R value indicates is the resistance to heat transfer. That is measured by both the thickness and the insulation type. So the common types of insulation that we see would be fiberglass batt insulation. That would be the commonly pink sheets that are rolled out. We also see blown-in fiberglass, blown-in cellulose, and then spray foam is an option, although at least I've been with the company for coming on 8 years now. I can't recall any instances where we have seen spray foam insulation in attics in Ontario, but it is something that we have come across at our location in British Columbia. Either way, regardless of what type of attic insulation you have, each type of insulation is going to offer a different R value per inch. So it's not quite as simple as saying you need a minimum of 24 inches of attic insulation. It is going to be dependent on the type of insulation. And then, of course, when it comes to the R values, the greater the value, the better it is at that reducing that heat transfer. So to achieve a greater R value, you can add additional insulation. And it's also possible to mix insulation types. So for example, if right now you have fiberglass batt insulation, but it's not achieving an R value of R60 and you want to increase it, you could say put in blown-in fiberglass over top of that, and it would just be adding the existing R value and the new R value to achieve the overall value of 60. So something to keep in mind, this is not always possible. But where possible, if there are major upgrades that are required to the attic, like if you do need to replace all of the insulation or update all the insulation, if it's possible to pair it up with a roof replacement project, that is the ideal time to be doing that. But either way, when you're having the roofs replaced, you should be taking a look at the attics to identify if there are any major repairs or upgrades that are required. And then also after the roof replacement project is done, just making sure that even if anything in the attic wasn't required to be replaced or altered, that any of the existing attic components are functioning properly with the new roof. So when you think about it, anybody that's installing a new roof is going to have to be touching attic components in some way. So they're going to be changing out the vents. They're going to be shingling over areas where there's cutouts for different ventilation. So you want to make sure that if there's existing cutouts, say for the air outtake ventilation, that they're not being roofed over, that there is a vent being installed there. This is a situation that we came across recently. We were doing some repairs on this roof surface and ended up seeing that there was a little bit of a dip and an opening in the roof surface here. So this was unrelated to the repairs that we were doing, but our guys went over to go check out what was happening here. And when they lifted the shingles up, they found that there were two exhaust vents here. One of them didn't have anything connected that we could see, whereas the other one did have ducting connected to it. Now, in this case, we didn't have access into the interior to see what was going on and if these were um, active exhaust vents. But either way, this is something that when the roofs were replaced over the last few years was an oversight and it was just roofed over. This is something that we've come across many times before. You also just want to make sure that, again, whether or not there's any repairs or replacements that are happening, uh, if uh, if the exhaust vents become disconnected while the roof replacement project is happening, that could lead to air leakage into the attic and condensation issues. So that brings us into the last portion of the presentation, and we're going to launch our fourth and final.
Okay, so the last poll here, are issues related to ice damming typically covered by warranties? Okay, let's see, we're almost at the level of participation for the first three. I'm gonna end the poll right now. Okay, perfect. So I'll share the results. Are issues related to ice damming typically covered by warranties? We have no, 59% of respondees saying no, 13% saying yes, and 28% saying not sure. I'm sure you'll let us know, Kelly.
All right. So something to keep in mind that with any roof replacement, whether it is on a sloped roof or a flat roof, regardless of if it's shingles or a waterproofing membrane, you should always be obtaining two warranties, one from the installing contractor and one from the manufacturer. So when it comes to shingled roofs, I have read through a lot of shingled roof manufacturer warranties. And in every one that I've read, they do have specifications clearly written in the warranty that state any issues related to ice damming or any issues related to the attic are not covered by their manufacturer warranty. As far as the installing contractor, that is, of course, going to depend on who the contractor is, on who the roofing company is. I will say that in our experience, when we've been addressing leaks that are happening at these roof surfaces that are brand new, if they are still under warranty, and the property manager is going back to them. I can't recall any case where the installing contractor has covered any issues that are related to ice damming, even if it is something that was an oversight during their installation that really they should be covering. So again, I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that one of the issues that we come across most often, especially when it comes to new roof installation, is that there's either not a metal drip edge or not any sort of waterproofing underlayment along that bottom row of shingles, which if there is ice damming occurring, it is very easy for the water to back up under these shingled areas and cause a leak into the area below. Another issue, and we're going to look at a few different cases here, is even if there's not any leaks directly happening from the ice damming, there could be condensation issues that are happening in the attic that can cause a leak into the interior occupied part of the space below. And even if the roof condition is fine and there's no shingle deficiencies, if everything is in great condition. So the first case that we want to take a look at here, we're going to go back to April of last year. At that time, we were offering a promotion that included one complimentary attic inspection. So this corporation did take us up on that. We had done an overall inspection of the roof and then the attic inspection here. So at the unit that we were looking at, there was a leak that had previously been reported as being active, and we could see that there was some staining happening inside the light fixture here. However, when we were on site for the attic inspection, it was actively and heavily raining outside, and there wasn't any leak activity. Now, not all leaks are going to be active during active rainfall, even if it is especially heavy. However, because of that and because of the temperature, it was possible that it could have been a condensation issue. So fortunately, we were there to look at the attic, which is what we did. And then just something of note is that in the time that we were taking a look at this corporation, it was 4 years old. So we had gone through our attic checklist, checked all the different components of the attic, the insulation, the vapor barrier, air intake, air outtake. All of these things were good. Everything seemed to be in good working condition. They even had wooden baffles installed at the soffit vents to allow that airflow channel. However, we did find that in the space they had three exhaust vents. In all of these cases, the fan box was on one side of the attic and the ducting was running horizontally along and installed at the lower edge of the roof. And in all cases, you can see a close-up photo here. It wasn't connected to the proper piece, and there is air leakage that's occurring here. You can see that there's some staining built up around these areas from condensation. And at the time of the assessment last year, there was some black staining and possible mold growth that was starting in this attic space. So at this time, we provided a report that stated what the findings were, and especially with these exhaust vents. And because of the fact that the corporation was only 4 years old, it did stand to reason that if this is how the exhaust vents were installed and connected in this unit, it's very likely this is how they were installed throughout the entire complex. So what we recommended was that the corporation inspect a few additional attics just to confirm if this was in fact how they were installed, and if it was confirmed that that was the case, make any necessary corrections and make sure that these were connected and sealed properly. Otherwise, it wasn't possible. It was inevitable that there would be additional condensation and potential ice damming concerns in the future. So ultimately, that did not happen. And I understand it's very easy to look at a situation after the fact and say, well, we should have done that or they should have done that. But we are hoping that by sharing situations like this, it's something that other people can learn from because it really does pay to be proactive, even if it's not something that's currently impacting you. So this year in particular, when we had all this heavy snowfall and ice accumulation, we investigated a total of 13 active leaks that were happening at this corporation. And as we were investigating them and accessing the attics, we were seeing all the same things that we came across last year in regards to the improperly connected exhaust ducting. So at this point, The level of black staining that we were seeing was more severe in a lot of cases, as we can see here. And then in a lot of cases, just the water staining and saturation on the underside of the wood deck was pretty severe in a lot of these units as well. So another one that we want to look at, in this case, the corporation, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head how old it was, but the roof has been replaced in the last few years. If you're looking at the roof surface itself, the shingles are in great condition. There aren't any installation deficiencies on the roof. Everything checks out and is looking good. The issue here is that there's a number of issues happening in the attic. So these are some photos of the underside of the wood deck in the attic, where throughout pretty much the entire thing, it's completely saturated, it's soft, it's starting to rot out. So looking at the air intake here, this particular unit is an end unit, so both on the front, the back, and the sides. Although if you look quickly, it looks like there are soffit vents installed. This one side doesn't have any actual perforated vents, so there is no air intake happening along here. And along the front and the back, it's not continuous throughout. There are only small sections that have the perforated soffits to allow for air intake. And then within the attic, the issue that we were talking about earlier with insulation being blown right to the edge of the roof surface, that's something that was happening here. So not only is there limited ventilation in place for air to get in, but then there's also that insulation that's blocking any airflow, outside airflow from getting in. In a lot of these cases, there was staining and in some cases frost built up along the roof edge where it was blocked. And then finally, so at one of the air outtake vents, there was active water from condensation that was dripping when we were on site here. And then similarly to what we've seen throughout this, a lot of the exhaust ventilation was not adequately connected, and therefore a lot of hot, moist air was just being pumped directly into the attic space. So there were a number of issues happening here. Shortly after doing this investigation, we did complete some different repairs. But ultimately, because of the state of the wood deck throughout this attic, it was ultimately recommended that the corporation complete a replacement. At the very least, at this roof, it's something that we would have to inspect further to see if it's an issue that's happening at other units. But again, this roof was not replaced that long ago, and already they're having to look at another replacement project. And then the final one that we want to look at here. So in this case, there were multiple leaks occurring in the unit. So in the living room area here, this I don't think is something that had just started. There was pretty significant black staining that was happening here. There was a leak that was happening at the access hatch going into the attic. And then also there was a previously reported leak in the bathroom area. There wasn't any staining or anything visible, but the resident had noted to our technician when he was on site that she had painted over the ceiling, so there weren't any visible signs of water staining there. So again, this corporation did have widespread ice damming that was happening, but either way, again, if there's an interior leak, accessing the attic is always a very important part just to see what's going on there. So in this case, similar to the last one, there was really severe staining throughout. All of the nails had water droplets coming from underneath them throughout the entire attic, staining at the chimney vent, the exhaust vent, was not properly connected. So again, you're experiencing that air leakage. And then finally, there was also an area that when the flashlights weren't turned on, you could see daylight from inside the attic. So meaning that there was some sort of opening on the roof surface. So going up onto the roof surface, this is a roof that had been replaced in the last few years, but was no longer covered under warranty. So first of all, you'll notice when we were talking about the overall snow coverage, you'll see that on this roof, really no snow. There's a little bit down on the bottom, although it's not a high level of snow on the separate roof areas. There is snow evenly distributed along these roof areas. So again, a sign that there's some issues happening in the attic, which we saw that there were. Over here along the metal fascia, there was a gap. So that's where the other side of that opening that could be seen in the attic, that's where that was coming from. And then this was a case where at first glance, there didn't appear to be any obvious defects to the shingles. However, doing some spot checks and lifting up some shingles, it was found that throughout the roof surface, the nails were installed too low. So with any shingle installation, there's a line. You can see a bit of the line here. The nails should always be installed above this so that it is completely covered by the shingle. If it's below this line or if it's exposed entirely and you can see the nail, that just presents a potential water entry point, especially if it starts to lift or rust over time. So in this case, many spots throughout the roof, we were finding these low nails. Also, by doing some spot checks throughout the roof, it was found that there were some areas that didn't have any sort of underlayment, including at the roof edge. So again, when any ice or water is built up there, it was getting underneath the shingles and saturating that plywood. There were also some areas where there was a felt paper installed. However, looking underneath that, water was still getting in and saturating the area below. So for this reason, we would just say that if you are having a replacement done, third-party oversight is so important, both to determine the specifications for the replacement and just to make sure that it is being completed to those specifications and you're not having any issues that are going to result in leaks in the years shortly following a roof replacement. We've come across so many cases where it's not always within the first year, but anything between 2 to 5 years, which is not a long time after the roof is being replaced. It should last you much longer than that before you start to see any leaks from things like natural aging or weather damages. So making sure that you have that oversight in place so that these things aren't being missed. And then so we're just going to get to our final pre-submitted question before we dive into our live Q&A. What maintenance can be done on the roof in fall to prevent ice damming? So there are a number of maintenance items that can be looked at in fall. However, are they going to prevent ice damming? Not so much. This would more so be to prevent any leaks or any leaks that could be related to ice damming issues. But again, if there are ice damming occurrences that have been happening this year or otherwise, we would really recommend inspecting the attic to see what's causing that melt of snow on roof surfaces. So for slope tubes specifically, some of the inspection items to look out for in the fall or earlier just to prepare for the winter season would be any missing or damaged shingles, any damaged vents or roof penetrations like flashing at plumbing stacks or at chimney vents, any missing or damaged metal fascia, any areas throughout, whether it's at the metal fascia, siding, these transitions between the gutter and the side of the roof surface, if that exists at your corporation. Any of these areas, if they are exposed, if there's any areas where plywood is visible. So in this case, and I apologize, it's a bit hard to see here, but this area that was exposed, there was exposed plywood behind this area. And then similarly here, no underlayment and no drip edge. So that's something to look out for as well during an inspection, just to see if those things are in place. So just to wrap up and some of the final thoughts here, just to reiterate, during any extreme winter weather, leaks can be more difficult to address. So at least if something is being done, focusing on any interior remediation, diverting water whenever possible until it can be more adequately addressed and dealt with. Multiple visits may be required in some cases if there is extreme winter weather. If there are any known ice damming issues, getting to the root of the issue by inspecting the attic, if there is an attic space present, and then determining what corrective solutions are relevant to that particular corporation. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So a lot of the times, as I was mentioning earlier, we get a lot of questions specifically about insulation. A lot of people think that adding more insulation or replacing insulation is going to solve ice damming issues, but that is just one component of the attic. You need to make sure that everything in the space is working properly to promote insulation, airflow, and ventilation. And then finally, with any replacement projects, making sure that you have oversight to ensure that there aren't going to be any deficiencies that can cause leaks, whether from installation errors or attic deficiencies shortly after that replacement is completed.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. And thank you everyone who has attended today. We're going to do a Q&A quickly, but just to let everyone know, Kelly mentioned it briefly, we are doing an attic inspection buy one, get one offer. That's going to be valid until May 30th. So if you are experiencing some of these attic issues, you're thinking about getting an assessment done, we're going to send that information over after the presentation in case that's something you'd like to consider. And if it's not, then we're not wasting too much of your time now and we can dive into the questions. So the first one that I have, I'll try to go through them rapid fire because I know we're at the end of time here. How often should you be inspecting your attic? We have two questions asking that. So as far as
Yes, so two things there. As far as having a professional come in and do a thorough inspection of your attic, it's not like your roof where we would say, inspect your roof a minimum of once a year. That is not a requirement for attics. I would say that as long as it's being checked in the first year as part of the performance audit to make sure that everything is functioning properly. From there, it would only be if there are any clear signs that would indicate the requirement for a more thorough attic inspection. Something that is possible or may be possible depending on your corporation, depending on your residents. If residents are able to just pop their head, not fully go into the attic, but pop their head in just to see if there can be any signs of staining, or especially in the winter months, if they're opening that and finding that it is really warm in there, it could be an indication that a thorough attic inspection is required. Having residents go up into the attic and be kind of poking around in there is not something that we would recommend, just because depending on the space, it can be a very small, tight space to work in. And also, it's very easy to accidentally disrupt certain things, especially if there's any plumbing or ventilation that is kind of hidden by the insulation. So we would recommend having only professionals go in and kind of work within the attic. But if it is possible for residents to identify any potential staining, or again, if there's ice damming issues, interior leaks, uneven snow coverage, or pest infiltration, that would be a sign to thoroughly inspect your attic.
okay. I have some I will string together because they're sort of related. So, old designs have fewer perforated soffits than newer buildings. Does this cause ice damming? Is this issue solved by bigger vents or installing more soffits? And then the other question, not the same but related, um, if the attic has insulation but still has ice damming issues, what solutions would be used to alleviate ice damming? So I'll just kind of I'll answer. Basically, if it's an older building, sometimes we've seen soffits, even this last storm, that were just the facade of it. It looked like a soffit, but it wasn't functioning as one, and we did have ventilation issues because of that. So it can depend. That could be a contributing factor. Similarly, insulation not being properly distributed could be a contributing factor, but those are a couple elements within the kind of ecosystem of the attic, and you're going to want to consider each area. So yes, make sure you have enough insulation. Cars outside. You're also going to want to make sure that your soffits are clear. It might not necessarily need more soffits, but you might want to install those baffles to get the air over the insulation. It really depends. So that's when you're going to want to do an attic inspection. Sometimes, even if you're meeting the requirements for building code, it might just not be as efficient as it needs to be, like when when everything's in place and put together. Do we have time for one more? maybe?
Sorry, I was muted. I would say for the sake of time, one more. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then let's see. Is ice damming always a sign of attic roof issues? Is it possible to have ice damming naturally on the roof with no issues? To answer this, I think generally, ice damming is a heat loss issue. So when when we're seeing significant, um, ice damming, and especially when it's just a steady temperature, that's likely attic and roofing issues. If it is, sometimes we'll have days where it will get really hot all of a sudden after a ton of snowfall, and then you're going to have that melt occurring. So that's where some icicles will form. If you see them in nature, a lot of times it's at like a lake or flowing water where there is that difference in temperature, and there's also areas where things can get clogged. So sometimes we see it if there's debris in the gutters. Then ice damming can occur because water is just stagnating. But basically anywhere where anything that is causing water to stagnate, or just be produced around the roof area. Normally it's heat loss. So the heat loss can happen even if you don't have an attic. It's not necessarily always going to be a roof and attic issue. I would say extreme cases, it is definitely a very likely culprit, and it should be checked. Yeah. Okay. We have more questions. We don't have time to answer them all. We will be reaching out to you with an email so we can respond to some of your questions as well, after the fact. And if you have any questions or pressing things that come up after we log out, feel free to email us and we'll get back to you right away with a response, or we'll review with our team and get back to you if it's something complicated.
And just to reiterate some of the
Mhm.
things that were mentioned at the beginning, so this presentation, your participation in this today, this is available to report in the CMRAO portal as of today. So the title of the presentation is February 2025 Winter Storm Review, Navigating Snow, Ice, and Leaks. I'll also be sending out an email before the end of this week that will have the name of that, just so you don't have to write it down. And again, just to reiterate, we are going to be sending the CMRAO the Zoom attendance report on registration. You entered your license information, so they will have all of that as your proof of attendance. We will not be issuing any sort of certificate that is sufficient for recording your involvement today. Finally, as mentioned, we will be uploading this presentation on YouTube if it is something that you want to view again or share with anything else, any peers or any of your board members. However, just a reminder that viewing the presentation does not count for CPE credit. It would just be for educational purposes only. Also for educational purposes, if there are any tidbits in here that you want to see again in the email that we send out, we also will include the slide deck so you have that for reference as well. With that in mind, that is all that we have for today. So thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. If you do have any further questions or if we can be of assistance for anything, our information is on the screen here, and please feel free to reach out to us at any time.
Thank you.